Our last chapter has to do with industrial space for leasing. This is kind of a specialized area because it covers mostly, well, there are several different kinds, and they're not as prevalent. Depends on, they tend to be more localized to areas of a community, or maybe some communities tend to focus more on industrial space. If you look on loopnet.com, LOOPNET.com, you can search for industrial space for rent in your area. And one of the first things you'll notice is that the square foot price for these spaces is much, much lower than it is for office or retail, because typically these buildings are very inexpensive to build. They're large and empty inside, very bare bones, concrete floors most often, maybe a metal building, and they're not well finished and beautiful on the inside, and they're not made for offices or that kind of thing where you're going to be displaying goods. You're going to be making things there, maybe storing things there, or using it for a distribution center. And so the price is very much cheaper. Often these properties also are on very long-term leases, because if you're going to bring in equipment and so forth to manufacture goods, you will want to make sure that you don't have to move every 5 or 10 years. So often you'll see these leases are very long. The book goes into some different kinds of industrial space. This is a very specialized area of property management, and a person really needs to get down in the weeds and learn a lot about it before they become an industrial property manager. So I want you to understand the concepts in the chapter, but this is probably the least important one. Not that everything's not important, but it's the one that is you're not as likely to encounter in your career unless you end up specializing in it. The biggest concerns that often are run into with industrial space is what is being done on the property, and what liability would the landlord have later on if somebody was using chemicals or doing something that would cause possibly some environmental damage. Those areas are very difficult and costly to clean up, so there's some oversight that the landlord would want to have over that type of business, and make sure that they have appropriate insurance in place to cover any kind of environmental damage. I lost my train of thought. Must not have been too important. The security issues are also a big concern, because if you are storing goods, for example, or even mini storage can be considered industrial, and you've got a lot of storage units with people's belongings in them, there could be some very valuable items. So you'll want to make sure that that good security is provided for that property. A couple of concepts that the chapter discusses that we haven't talked about before. The first one is the idea that in a space where you have multiple tenants, you might also divide up those units into condominium space. And that's very similar to a condominium that you might live in, where there's one building with a number of units in it, but each of the units is individually conveyed and owned by an owner, rather than the entire building being owned by an owner and then leasing out the individual units. You can also do that with office space and with retail and some other kinds of space, and it's very common. And so if you're a landlord, you might own one space in a large building, and then you would have some shared responsibility with the other owners in that building, like a strip mall or an industrial space that has multiple manufacturing or distribution facilities. In that one facility, you might have an area that you actually own yourself that's carved out. It has its own legal description, and then you'd have some common area maintenance charges like you would with a retail space or office. The other concept, if I can remember it now, that I wanted this is the concept of a ground lease. We haven't talked about that a lot either. This is very common in commercial development across the board, frankly. Many times somebody owns a piece of property and they don't want to sell it outright, but they want it to be used for some purpose. So they will enter into a ground lease with a tenant. They will lease that property to the tenant, and the tenant typically builds something on it. The lease is often for a period of 99 years, because if you build a building, you want to make sure you're going to be able to have the building stay there for a while. And that is very common. I also see it used actually in some affordable housing developments where they want to keep the properties affordable, so they'll lease the property to a developer to build units on it and then rent those out. But the underlying ground remains in ownership of a government entity or a nonprofit organization, that kind of thing. It's also a tool used in commercial development. So you might actually only own the building itself, and you lease the dirt that the building is built on. And that's another kind of a lease, and that's something else that the book talks about a little bit that we haven't discussed in the past. Those are things that when you encounter them, you should understand how they work and what they do. Probably, unless you're very heavily involved in industrial property management or commercial, you won't run into that very often in your life, but at least you'll know what it is if you didn't already know.